The year is 1174. Jerusalem, a kingdom forged in the fires of the First Crusade, stands as a fragile beacon of Christian power in the heart of the Holy Land. But the kingdom is not strong. Its greatest threat is not a mighty army, but a wasting disease that gnaws at the bones of its young king. Barely 13 years old, Baldwin IV inherited a kingdom rife with discord. His coronation in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not a celebration, but a somber acknowledgment of the heavy burden placed upon such young and diseased shoulders. Raymond III of Tripoli, a powerful and experienced nobleman, stepped forward as regent. He represented the interests of the established Crusader families, the barons who had carved out their domains and understood the delicate balance of power in the region. Sibylla, Baldwin's sister, watched the political dance with keen eyes. She understood that her brother's illness made her a key player in the succession, and she was determined to secure her position and that of any future offspring. Balian of Ibelin, a respected lord known for his integrity and martial prowess, stood as a voice of reason. He sought to bridge the divides and maintain stability, but the currents of ambition were strong. The military orders, particularly the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, held vast territories and considerable influence. They answered only to the Pope, often acting as a law unto themselves, a powerful force within the kingdom that further fractured the central power. One of Baldwin's initial challenges was navigating the complex web of alliances and rivalries with the surrounding Muslim states. Maintaining a fragile peace was paramount, but constant vigilance was required. Raymond, ever the pragmatist, advocated for diplomacy and cautious expansion. He understood the limits of the kingdom's resources and the dangers of overextension. Sibylla, however, harbored grander ambitions. She saw the need for a strong and decisive ruler, someone who could unite the kingdom and drive back the encroaching Muslim threat. Her gaze fell towards Europe and potential husbands. The kingdom of Jerusalem, a patchwork of fiefdoms and loyalties, was a kingdom divided. The nobility, the military orders, the church, all vying for power, their ambitions threatening to tear the fragile state apart. Yet, amidst the political maneuvering and the ever-present threat of war, young Baldwin, the leper king, prepared to face his destiny. He would strive to hold his fractured kingdom together, with a will as strong as his body was frail. Jerusalem, a city of God, a prize of kings, a kingdom on the brink. Its fate and the fate of its young, ailing king hung precariously in the balance. The year of our Lord 1175 brought no respite to the kingdom of Jerusalem. To the east, the shadow of Saladin lengthened, his Ayyubid dynasty consolidating power in Egypt and Syria. The uneasy peace that had held for a time was fraying, replaced by the constant threat of war. Raymond of Tripoli, ever vigilant, strengthened the defenses of his lands in the north. Skirmishes along the border with Saladin's territories became increasingly frequent, small probing raids designed to test the kingdom's strength. Further south, Balian of Ibelin received reports of increased Ayyubid activity near Ascalon. Saladin's forces were testing the defenses of the coastal cities, seeking weaknesses in the Crusaders' armor. In Jerusalem, King Baldwin convened a war council. The discussion centered on the kingdom's defenses, the network of Crusader castles, the fortified cities, and the strategies employed to repel Muslim incursions. Raymond argued for a cautious approach. He advocated for strengthening the existing fortifications and avoiding direct confrontation with Saladin's superior numbers. "Let us bleed them slowly," he urged, attriting their forces against our walls. Balian, however, proposed a more aggressive defense. He suggested utilizing the kingdom's skilled knights in swift cavalry raids, disrupting Saladin's supply lines and preventing him from massing his forces for a major assault. Baldwin listened patiently, weighing the counsel of his advisors. He knew that the survival of the kingdom depended on unity and strategic brilliance, but his own failing health added another layer of uncertainty to their deliberations. Sibylla, ever mindful of her own position and the future of the kingdom, watched the proceedings with a keen eye. She understood that the struggle against Saladin was not just a military one, but also a political one, a game of power and influence. Along the coast, Crusader knights maintained a vigilant watch. The port cities like Acre and Tyre were vital to the kingdom's survival, providing crucial supplies and reinforcements from overseas. The peace remained uneasy, punctuated by sudden bursts of violence. Saracen raiders, striking from the shadows, harassed Crusader supply convoys, disrupting trade and sowing fear among the populace. In the face of these challenges, Baldwin turned to prayer, seeking solace and guidance in the Holy Sepulchre. He knew that the fate of the kingdom rested not only on military strength, but also on divine favor. And to the east, Saladin watched and waited, patiently gathering his forces. He knew that the time for a decisive blow was drawing near. The kingdom of heaven and earth stood on the precipice, its future hanging in the balance. The year is 1177. Against all odds, King Baldwin IV prepared to face Saladin's massive army near Montchesard. Despite the debilitating effects of leprosy ravaging his body, his spirit remained unbroken, a beacon of hope for his outnumbered forces. Raymond of Tripoli, ever the pragmatist, advised caution, but Baldwin's resolve was unshakable. He saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against Saladin, while the Ayyubid forces were scattered and laden with plunder after raiding the area. The element of surprise was their only advantage. Balian of Ibelin, ever loyal and steadfast, rode by the king's side, his heart heavy with foreboding but his resolve unwavering. The odds were stacked against them, but the defense of Jerusalem demanded their utmost. With a thunderous roar, the Crusader army surged forward, led by the frail but determined leper king. Baldwin, wielding his sword with surprising strength, embodied the desperate courage of his kingdom. Raymond of Tripoli, a seasoned warrior, cleaved through the enemy ranks, his experience and strength turning the tide in crucial moments. The Crusaders fought with the ferocity of men defending their homes and their faith. Balian of Ibelin, with his tactical acumen, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, sowing chaos and confusion among Saladin's surprised forces. The Ayyubid army, expecting only scattered resistance, was caught completely off guard. As the sun began to set, the battle reached its climax. Saladin's army, routed and demoralized, fled in disarray. Baldwin, though weakened, stood victorious amidst the carnage, a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. Even Raymond, who had questioned Baldwin's decision, knelt before the young king, acknowledging his courage and leadership. The victory at Montchesard was a testament to Baldwin's unwavering faith and tactical brilliance. Balian, ever the compassionate leader, oversaw the care of the wounded, both Crusader and Saracen alike. Even in victory, he recognized the human cost of war. In Jerusalem, Sibylla received news of the victory with a carefully guarded expression. While relieved for her brother's safety and the kingdom's survival, she understood that Montchesard had only bought them time. The question of succession still loomed large. Baldwin returned to Jerusalem a hero. He knelt in the Holy Sepulchre, giving thanks for the miraculous victory, but aware that even miracles could only delay the inevitable. His health was failing, and the kingdom remained vulnerable. In the aftermath of Montchaussade, the political machinations continued. Raymond and Balian, deeply concerned about the future, met in secret, knowing that the hard-won victory had only postponed the inevitable crisis of succession. The kingdom of Jerusalem remained poised on the precipice, its fate uncertain. The year is 1178. Baldwin, though victorious at Montchaussade, knows his triumph is fleeting. The shadow of succession looms, a constant reminder of his mortality and the kingdom's precarious future. He must secure an heir, or Jerusalem will be plunged into chaos. Raymond of Tripoli, ever the pragmatist, sees the dangers inherent in Baldwin's decline. He believes a strong, stable succession is paramount, one that favors the native barons and their established interests. He begins to quietly consolidate his power, positioning himself as the voice of reason and stability. Sibylla, aware of her own claim to the throne, navigates the treacherous court with a carefully constructed facade. She understands that her marriage will be the key to her future, and thus, the future of the kingdom. Her ambition burns bright, veiled by a veneer of dutiful sisterly concern. Balian of Ibelin, ever the voice of reason, attempts to steer Baldwin towards a solution that benefits the kingdom as a whole. He understands the delicate balance between the various factions and urges the king to consider all options before making a decision on Sibylla's marriage. Baldwin weighs his options, knowing that any decision he makes will have far-reaching consequences. He seeks counsel from trusted advisors, but ultimately, the burden of choice rests upon his weakened shoulders. The letter he writes is addressed to the Pope, seeking guidance. Raymond and Balian, despite their differing approaches, share a common goal: to preserve the kingdom. They meet in secret to discuss potential candidates for Sibylla's hand, seeking someone who will unite the factions rather than exacerbate the existing divisions. Sibylla, not one to be passive, orchestrates her own plans. She cultivates alliances with those who support her claim, subtly undermining those who stand in her way. The message contains news of a potential suitor, one of her own choosing. Baldwin announces his intention to find Sibylla a husband, opening the floor for suggestions and debate. The council erupts into a cacophony of voices, each faction vying for influence and control. The tensions between the native barons and the newcomers from Europe are palpable. Balian attempts to bring a sense of order to the proceedings, appealing to the council's sense of duty, and urging them to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. His words, though wise, are often drowned out by the clamor of competing interests. Sibylla, watching the council meeting unfold, realizes that she must act decisively if she is to secure her own future. She knows that the king's health is failing, and the time to strike is drawing near. Raymond, surveying the kingdom from the walls of Jerusalem, sees the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He knows that the question of succession is not just a matter of politics, but a matter of survival for the kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin, weakened by his disease, collapses. The question of succession is no longer a distant threat, but an imminent crisis. The future of the kingdom of Jerusalem hangs precariously in the balance, threatening to plunge the kingdom into civil war. The year is 1179. The victory at Montchaussade had bought the kingdom of Jerusalem time, but within the city walls, a different kind of battle was brewing. Factionalism, like an insidious disease, was eating away at the unity of the realm. Raymond of Tripoli, ever the pragmatist, saw the danger clearly. The Lusignans, newly arrived from France, were gaining influence, challenging the established nobility. He met with Balian of Ibelin to discuss the growing tensions. Balian, ever the voice of reason, cautioned restraint, but the whispers of conspiracy had already begun to circulate like desert winds, poisoning the well of trust. Sibylla, her ambition a smoldering fire, understood the stakes better than most. Her marriage was the key, the linchpin upon which the future of the kingdom would turn. Baldwin, trapped within his decaying body, saw the kingdom fracturing before his eyes. Each day brought fresh betrayals, each whispered plot a further erosion of his authority. The military orders, particularly the Templars, were becoming increasingly assertive, their allegiance often dictated by their own interests rather than the good of the kingdom. Raymond's distrust of them deepened with each passing day. Balian, torn between loyalty to the king and his growing concern for the realm, sought to understand Sibylla's intentions. The future of Jerusalem rested on her shoulders, whether she realized it or not. Sibylla remained an enigma, her true feelings masked behind a facade of regal composure. Was she driven by ambition, or by a genuine desire to protect the kingdom? Only time would tell. As Baldwin's health continued to decline, the vultures began to circle. Each cough, each spasm, fueled the fires of ambition within the hearts of those who sought to claim his throne. Raymond, sensing the impending storm, retreated to his lands in Tripoli, preparing for the inevitable conflict. The unity of the kingdom was shattered, perhaps beyond repair. Balian remained in Jerusalem, a steadfast presence at the king's side. He knew that Baldwin's days were numbered, and with him, perhaps, the kingdom of Jerusalem itself. Sibylla, kneeling in prayer, faced the daunting prospect of inheriting a kingdom riddled with intrigue and teetering on the brink of collapse. The cost of ambition, she was beginning to realize, was far greater than she had ever imagined. The year is 1180. Whispers turned to gasps as Sibylla, sister to the leper king, was wed not to a seasoned warrior or a shrewd diplomat, but to Guy of Lusignan, a man of charm but untested mettle. The royal court, once a stage for measured politics, now teetered on the precipice of outright division. Baldwin, ever aware of the kingdom's precarious position, hoped this union would bring stability. But the choice of Guy sparked resentment among the established barons, who saw him as an upstart, a foreigner with no claim to power in the Holy Land. Raymond of Tripoli, a man who had held the reins of the kingdom during Baldwin's minority, felt betrayed. Guy's sudden rise threatened the delicate balance of power he had so carefully maintained. His discontent simmered, a dangerous undercurrent in the already turbulent waters of the court. Balian of Ibelin, ever the voice of reason, watched with growing unease. He knew the marriage would further divide the kingdom, weakening it at a time when unity was paramount. He feared Guy's appointment would empower the court faction and lead to disaster. As the celebrations continued, Sibylla couldn't shake off a nagging feeling of uncertainty. Was this truly the man who would protect her and the kingdom? Or had she, in her ambition, made a grave mistake? Raymond and Balian, sharing their concerns, realized the depth of the crisis facing the kingdom. Guy's inexperience and the barons' resentment could lead to internal strife, leaving them vulnerable to Saladin's ever-growing power. Baldwin, weakened by his illness, felt his control slipping. He knew that without unity, the kingdom was doomed. But could he, in his fragile state, mend the growing rift between the factions? Sibylla, confronted by Raymond's open disapproval, attempted to defend her choice, but his words cut deep, reminding her of the potential consequences of her ambition. The future of the kingdom hangs precariously. Guy, eager to prove himself, attempts to assert his authority, but his lack of experience and the baron's disdain hinder his efforts. He struggles to gain the respect of the kingdom's seasoned warriors. Balian, recognizing the dire situation, calls for unity among the barons, pleading with them to set aside their personal ambitions for the sake of the kingdom. His plea echoes through the hall, but the seeds of discord have already been sown. Raymond, feeling increasingly marginalized, retreats to Tripoli, further isolating himself from the royal court. The kingdom, once a fragile entity, now threatened to shatter under the weight of its internal divisions. Baldwin, watching the sun set over Jerusalem, knew that the kingdom was on a dangerous path. The marriage of Sibylla had unleashed forces beyond his control, threatening to consume everything he had worked so hard to preserve. The sands of time were running out. The year is 1181. A fragile truce held between the kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's Ayyubid Sultanate. Yet, like thin ice over a deep chasm, it threatened to shatter at any moment. In Tripoli, Raymond wrestled with maintaining the peace along his borders. Raids by Bedouin tribes, often instigated by agents of both sides, tested his patience and resources. Balian, ever the pragmatist, understood the value of the truce, but he also saw its inherent weaknesses. Small skirmishes and banditry were undermining any semblance of stability. Each report of violated agreements chipped away at Baldwin's resolve. He knew the kingdom could not withstand another full-scale war, yet the provocations were relentless. Within the royal court, voices clamored for action. Guy de Lusignan, eager to prove himself, fueled the flames of discontent, whispering of Saladin's treachery and the need for a strong response. Raymond, ever cautious, argued for continued negotiations. He knew Saladin's strength and the kingdom's precarious position. War, he believed, would be disastrous. Balian attempted to find a middle ground, to salvage the truce while preparing for the inevitable conflict. But the divisions within the kingdom were too deep, the mistrust too ingrained. The decision fell to Baldwin. With a heavy heart, he authorized a limited mobilization, a show of force intended to deter further aggression, but it was a step towards war. Along the coast, knights and soldiers gathered, their armor glinting in the sun. The call to arms had been sounded, and the kingdom braced itself for what was to come. Across the border, Saladin watched and waited, his own forces mobilizing in response. The game of cat and mouse was over. The hunt was about to begin. Raymond surveyed his lands, a sense of foreboding weighing heavily on his heart. He knew the kingdom stood on the precipice of disaster, and he could only hope to mitigate the damage. In Jerusalem, Baldwin prayed for his kingdom, for his people, and for a miracle that might avert the coming storm. But the sands of time were running out, and the kingdom of heaven and earth teetered on the brink. 1187. The truce with Saladin was shattered. Reynold of Chatillon, lord of Ultra-Jourdain, provoked the Ayyubid Sultan by attacking a Muslim caravan, igniting the tinderbox of religious animosity. Baldwin, weakened and nearing his end, knew the kingdom teetered on the brink. Raymond of Tripoli advocated for diplomacy, for appeasement, a course of action many considered cowardly. Guy de Lusignan, Baldwin's brother-in-law and now regent, favored a more aggressive stance, influenced by Chatillon's bellicosity and his own ambition. Sibylla, torn between her loyalty to her brother and her ambition for her husband, remained a silent observer, aware that the fate of the kingdom rested upon the choices being made. Balian of Ibelin, ever the voice of reason, tried to bridge the divide, to forge a united front against the looming threat. But his words were lost in the rising tide of anger and mistrust. Baldwin, his body failing him, could only watch as his kingdom spiraled towards disaster. His illness robbed him of the strength to command, to unite his fractious lords. Raymond, despite the rebukes of the court, pursued his own path. He met with Saladin's representatives, seeking to avert the inevitable conflict, his efforts ultimately proving futile. The die was cast. Guy, swayed by reckless advisers, made a fatal error. Against the council of seasoned commanders, he marched the Crusader army from the springs of Saphuria toward Tiberias, leaving them exposed in the arid landscape. Balian, riding with the vanguard, recognized the folly of their position. The Crusader army, burdened by heavy armor and lack of water, was marching into a desert oven. Thirst gnawed at them. The heat shimmered, playing tricks on the eye. Discipline began to fray. The army, once a symbol of Crusader strength, was becoming a straggling, desperate mob. Saladin watched, his army surrounding the Crusaders. He had them where he wanted them, trapped, vulnerable, and desperate. The stage was set for a decisive battle. Raymond, knowing the gravity of their situation, pleaded with Guy to retreat to the springs of Hattin. But Guy, blinded by pride and manipulated by his advisers, refused to yield. As night fell, a sense of impending doom settled upon the Crusader camp. They were trapped, thirsty, and surrounded. The road to Hattin had led them to the brink of destruction. The kingdom of Jerusalem teetered on the edge of oblivion. The year is 1187. Though Baldwin IV had passed away, the consequences of the decisions made during his reign were now crashing down upon the kingdom of Jerusalem. The news from the north was dire. Saladin had amassed his forces near Tiberias. Raymond of Tripoli urged caution. Tiberias, his own city, was threatened, but he argued for a defensive strategy. He knew Saladin's strength and the kingdom's precarious position. Guy of Lusignan, now king consort, driven by pride and the influence of Reynold of Chatillon, insisted on an immediate offensive. Balian of Ibelin, ever the voice of reason, attempted to mediate. He understood the dangers of both inaction and rash action, but the die was cast. Guy, swayed by ambition and the taunts of those eager for battle, ordered the army to march. The Crusader army, a force of around 20,000 men including knights, foot soldiers, and mercenaries, began its fateful march towards Tiberias. The summer heat was relentless, the land barren, and water was scarce. The soldiers suffered terribly from thirst and exhaustion. Saladin's army, a formidable force estimated to be twice the size of the Crusader army, shadowed their every move. They harassed the Crusaders, cutting off their access to water sources and setting fire to the dry grasslands, adding to their misery. Raymond pleaded with Guy to change course and head for the springs of Hattin, the only reliable water source in the area. But Guy, stubborn and increasingly desperate, refused. He was determined to relieve Tiberias, even if it meant sacrificing his army. On July 4, 1187, the Battle of Hattin commenced. The Crusaders, parched and exhausted, fought valiantly, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The heat was unbearable, their thirst agonizing. King Guy, his judgment clouded by thirst and desperation, ordered his men to pitch their tents on the exposed plain, hoping for a miracle. But no miracle came. During the night, Saladin's forces surrounded them, setting fire to the dry brush and further tormenting the already suffering Crusaders. Raymond of Tripoli, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, led a desperate charge with a small group of knights, managing to break through Saladin's lines. It was a tactical withdrawal, not a victory. He knew the battle was lost. The battle ended in a crushing defeat for the Crusaders. Thousands were killed and many more were taken prisoner. The true cross, a sacred relic carried into battle, fell into Saladin's hands. King Guy and Reynold of Chatillon were brought before Saladin. Guy was spared, but Reynold, whose treachery had ignited the conflict, was executed by Saladin himself. The news of the catastrophe at Hattin spread like wildfire. Jerusalem was thrown into despair. The kingdom's army was destroyed, its leadership captured or killed, and its defenses shattered. The path to Jerusalem lay open to Saladin. The kingdom of heaven and earth was on the brink of collapse. The year of our Lord 1187 bore witness to a sight that chilled the hearts of Christendom. Jerusalem, the holy city, lay encircled by Saladin's forces. The dreams and sacrifices of generations of crusaders were about to face their ultimate test. Within the city, Balian of Ibelin, a man of honor and resolve, rallied the remaining defenders. Knights, townsfolk, and even the elderly prepared for a siege that seemed destined to end in tragedy. Hope was dwindling, resources were stretched thin, and the specter of Saladin's victory loomed large. For weeks, the defense held, fueled by desperation and faith. But Saladin's siege engines pounded relentlessly, breaching the walls and forcing the defenders into a desperate, bloody struggle. Each passing day brought Jerusalem closer to its inevitable fate. Realizing the futility of further resistance and seeking to prevent a massacre, Balian rode out to parley with Saladin. He sought terms of surrender that would spare the city's inhabitants. Saladin, a man of his word and a leader respected even by his enemies, agreed to terms. He offered safe passage to those who could pay a ransom, while those who could not would be enslaved. A bitter pill, but one Balian had to accept. The gates of Jerusalem opened, not to triumphant crusaders, but to a sorrowful procession of refugees. Families, stripped of their homes and security, streamed out, leaving behind a city they had called their own for nearly a century. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem returned to Muslim hands. The crescent replaced the cross atop the dome of the rock, signaling the end of Crusader rule in the holy city. Balian, having done all he could, watched from the Mount of Olives as the city slipped from Christian control. A profound sense of loss washed over him, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. The remaining Crusader strongholds, such as Tyre, Acre, and Tripoli, became havens for the fleeing Christians. Raymond of Tripoli and other surviving leaders gathered to plan their next move, to salvage what remained of the kingdom. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe, sending shockwaves across Christendom. Pope Urban III is said to have died of grief upon hearing the news. The call for a new crusade echoed throughout the continent. The seeds of the Third Crusade were sown in the fertile ground of loss and outrage. Kings and emperors prepared to lead their armies to the Holy Land, vowing to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. As Balian left Jerusalem, he knew the dream of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was far from over. The loss of the city was a devastating blow, but it also ignited a fire that would burn for generations to come. The legacy of the Crusades, a complex tapestry of faith, ambition, and violence, would continue to shape the world for centuries.